some people on the far right and some people on the far left will dislike an attack on polarization, but I dislike them.
My introduction to the works of British writer-director Alex Garland was through his 2015 film Ex Machina, which I saw on my first ever Tinder date, who, after the film was over, went on to spew a bunch of racist and misogynistic ideologies, and then nearly cried over the fact that he's such a nice guy, so everyone just assumes he's gay. While my experience of the film was most certainly colored by just like the incredible political debates that ensued, I still find myself nearly 10 years later leaving the theater of an Alex Garland film just so politically overwhelmed, but now by the actual content of his films. Allow me to elaborate. Alex Garland's 2024 film Civil War is his biggest box office hit yet. The film was released to mixed reactions, some praising it for Garland's portrayal of just the very relevant issues of political polarization and fears rising surrounding contemporary politics, while others criticized the film for not really choosing a side and for being a bit cowardly. The film follows Lee Smith, portrayed by Kirsten Dunst, a seasoned and kind of weathered war photojournalist, haunted by the violence that she captured in her career. Lee works alongside Joel, portrayed by Wagner Moura, a Reuters journalist who's just like addicted to the thrill of his high-risk, high-reward job. The duo, on a road trip-style quest to Washington, D.C. to interview the fascist three-term president of the United States, portrayed by Nick Offerman, are joined by old-school New York Times journalist Sammy, portrayed by Stephen McKinley Henderson, and aspiring 23-year-old photojournalist and longtime fan of Lee Smith, Jesse, played by Kaylee Spaney. On this trip, the group sees just so many acts of horrific violence, which they capture with just pure journalistic integrity, aka staying neutral. While we get hints of the current political climate with cameos from Jesse Plemons playing an ultranationalist, racist militant, and whatever Garland was trying to do with this scene,
the Antifa massacre,
we don't really get proper context for what started this war. And this was done very intentionally. Garland has been extremely outspoken about his decision to keep the politics of the film quite open-ended, functioning more as a conversation between the right and left sides of the political spectrum, discussing political extremism and the violence that ensues from it. Now, all the films of Alex Garland are works of science fiction grounded in ideas of community, human nature, and violence in one way or another. In the first film that he wrote, 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle, my favorite movie of all time, Garland wrote on a zombie rage virus accidentally created out of a lab, causing affected humans to turn into mindless, hungry, and violent zombies. Through the events of the film, it turns out that unaffected humans can be just as violent and monstrous as the affected creatures. Similarly, Garland's 2021 film Men discusses the effects of toxic masculinity breeding toxic masculinity, something that he presented, badly, but it was presented nevertheless. So Garland's, cinematic universe is based in ideas of breeding hate and rage, of harnessing the essence of humanity to create new communities, and ideas that are based in fascism, neoliberalism, violence, and unethical technological processes. So, how does this function in Civil War? The polarizing divide of America's two-party system is something that's been going on for decades, something that Garland is very aware of. He also understands that social media has really heightened this political polarization, something that we can glean from both his interviews and from a few talking points from his film Ex Machina. He feels as though the violence that's been kind of just brewing from this political turmoil could lead to more serious and violent implications for the states, which I get where he's coming from with that one. Through this film, I feel as though Garland is really asking 4 questions. What would a civil war in the states look like? How would news of a civil war be transmitted through the states? What would cause a civil war, and how could a civil war be prevented? Now, the answers to the first 2 questions are answered in the film, while the second 2 questions are purposefully left a bit open-ended. Garland is less focused on trying to figure out what would cause a civil war right now because he believes that it's pretty obvious and the audience should know.
I make assumptions on the audience, and one of the assumptions I make is they know.
They know the answer to that question already. I don't need to say it.
That being the rise of radicals on both the right and left ends of the political spectrum.
Some people on the far right and some people on the far left will dislike an attack on polarization, but I dislike them.
Now, while this is a statement that I don't completely agree with, I understand where Garland's coming from. I understand kind of like his fears of the rising political polarization coming from algorithmically created social media news and these online communities, which I'm going to get more into in a second. I don't like Civil War. I had a terrible time watching it in theaters. I had an even worse time rewatching it for the research for this video. I thought it was painfully boring. I thought that it tried oddly hard to just be like pretentious indie bait. And its politics like genuinely confuse me. I've just been thinking about Civil War so much for the last 2 months. And I've heard all the arguments as to why this is a bad movie. Like I said before, like him not taking a side, it being cowardly, being too neutral, and, you know, like smaller ideas like, why are Texas and California on the same side? That would never happen. That makes no sense. But none of these arguments have really like satiated my deep desire to get to the bottom of why I hate Civil War so much. In this video, I really want to get to the root of some of these questions. And through doing so, I'd really like to just like crawl into the head of Garland and really try to understand where he's coming from. And then from that point on, I'd like to kind of like move back a bit and discuss some theory and give some context regarding some of the ideas that the film discusses, just to really unpack why this film feels so hollow, why Garland seems to completely misunderstand issues of journalism, hatred, political polarization, and kind of more broadly just like violence in America. And since Garland doesn't want to provide any context for the film, don't worry, I am martyring myself. I will be providing way more context than you probably even wanted. And also, while I have your attention, thank you so much for being on my channel, for watching this video. If you couldn't tell, am still a teeny tiny channel, and I love making these videos. I would love to keep growing on this platform. So if you could just take this little second to hit subscribe if you haven't already, if you want to share it with your friends when you're done, if you want to comment, like, that would be amazing. But back to the video. So why does Garland focus his film that deals with some pretty intense and huge American political issues on journalism? I am sorry to tell you that the reason is actually kind of boring.
My dad worked for a newspaper and as a cartoonist, and so my family home was always full of journalists, and what can I say, I really like them, and they've had paradoxically a bad press recently.
Basically, Garland just like really fucks with journalists, and they're a group of people he feels really comfortable writing about. Fair enough. Like they say in film school, write what you know. Interestingly, in an interview with Tom Porter, when probed about why he chose to portray his journalist characters like he did, Garland wasn't super well spoken on the topic. He was kind of just like, well, what if we portrayed journalists of different age groups? Wouldn't that be interesting?
They're representing different phases of life, and in response to the problems that they're facing.
Help me understand that better. What do you mean by that?
Is the Watergate problem, which is that if that story was reported now, would it change things in the way it needs to change things?
No, it wouldn't, but it's kind of an interesting thought
So
experiment, no? He didn't say it exactly like that, but that's basically what he said. And if it's not very clear yet, I'm far from the #1 biggest Alex Garland fan in the world. So if you want like a more objective take on some of the things he said in these interviews, I've linked this interview. I've linked the Piss Take Pod Save America interview and some others if you want to check them out. They're kind of funny, like especially the Pod Save America one. He's kind of sitting there like,
I can't be prejudiced because I have right-wing friends.
journalism is political. And even if some news organizations preach the idea of neutrality or being nonpartisan, the act of just transmitting this news to the public is a very political act, I think. When speaking on the impact and importance of journalism, Garland speaks to the work done in the Vietnam War, in which coverage of the atrocities the American government were committing against the Vietnamese population radically influenced popular American trust in the intentions of the US government and military in their war against communism. The idea that coverage of the Vietnam War was more factual, therefore more objective, isn't exactly correct. Yes, it's true that this war was a huge turning point for how journalism in America functioned, just due to the sheer amount of information being shared with the public that the US government didn't really like. But I think that this has less to do with like journalistic objectivity and more about just like loosening censorship laws of the time. In researching this video, I spoke with my good friend Katia Lo Inez, who works for The Breach, a really cool left-wing independent journalist outlet. So I'd love to share some of our conversation.
When you speak as a journalist from this place of like objectivity, as in treating it like a science, it is pretty false, because you effectively are just upholding the current power structure. Like you were just basically supporting the state. And I think there's kind of a difference between journalists who want to uphold that power and kind of like bear witness to history versus like journalists who, to go with the cheesy adage, hold truth to power. And it is impossible to hold truth to power if you stay like this passive spectator, because that like misunderstands the role of journalists as kind of like passive observers of these events rather than people who actively shape how history is understood, how these political contexts affect other people. Like as a journalist, like just how you report on things can greatly shape how people think about them, and by extension, like how governments legislate.
In The View from Somewhere, Undoing the Myth of Journalistic Objectivity, transgender journalist Lewis Raven Wallace writes on his experience as a journalist from a marginalized background, trying to come to terms with the meaning of journalistic objectivity. He posits that journalistic objectivity has more to do with presenting oneself as detached and neutral than actually presenting information from a neutral standpoint, something that would be nearly impossible to do. He further states that, quote, objectivity has the tendency to objectify, turning people into flat-nut sources whose stories are there for the taking, encouraging an extractive approach to journalism in which the journalist is never implicated or accountable, unquote. And this idea is really interesting to me because a huge problem I had with the movie was the way that the journalists were characterized. I found them to just be like very one-dimensional. I know this is something that Garland doesn't agree with.
And you've said it's about the importance of objective journalism. I talked to a journalist walking out of the screening who said she was surprised because she felt that it was actually critical of journalists and that the characters seemed to care more about getting the story and the shot than they did about anything else, even their fellow citizens and their country falling apart all around them and people dying. What do you say to that?
Well, I'd say that's a subjective response, and that's typical of responses to stories when you offer them up. That is to say, my subjective response is that it's admiring of journalists, and hers is that it's critical. Listen, it's not as clear as she'd like, maybe, but that's sort of my stock in trade. So
I guess for me, the whole idea of trying to take like an objective journalist standpoint just felt very flat and voyeuristic to me. And while Garland really tries to dissect why people might not take this objective sort of journalism as seriously anymore, I feel as though he accidentally kind of ends up portraying why this kind of journalism might not be that effective, and I think it was kind of just like a self-own. In one scene, Lee talks about the fact that through Civil War breaking out in America, she feels as though she failed as a photojournalist.
Every time I survived a war zone and got the photo, I thought I was sending a warning home.
Another thing that kind of just left me like scratching my head a little bit was why Garland decided to have his young character be portrayed as just like so born in the wrong generation. Like, I understand the fact that young people like me are still very into film photography. I have many a friend who still dabbles in the medium, but I feel as though this was such a lost opportunity for Garland to really play into the idea of pre and post internet news reporting, something that Garland so clearly feels very passionately about. He talks about it a lot in his interviews, especially in the Pod Save America one. Also, while I'm here, I feel like, I don't know, like the use of like old dad rock.
Listen to production. Production's like Abbey Road.
Of like glamorizing film photography and of like this thing just really feels like a failed attempt at 2013 indie pretentiousness. And I should know, I wore a beret in 2013, so I know a thing or two about failed indie pretentiousness. Now, Garland never openly speaks about the kind of idea of algorithmically created online communities, but in his conversation on Pod Save America, he does explicitly express his distaste for like the mob mentality, polarizing effects of social media.
And social media is just a rampantly capitalist, unregulated exercise with a tiny group of super, super rich, overpowerful people with a kind of politics that makes me twitch. And
Garland's 2014 directorial debut, Ex Machina, also briefly touches on the unethical use of social media and internet search history data, in which tech mogul Nathan creates an AI babe using data unethically extracted from conversations and online activity of billions of internet users worldwide, something that the film viewer can recognize as being unethical. Garland effectively portrays the use of user data in the scene where Nathan explains how Eva was created. Okay, so I can't actually play the clip because of copyright, but basically Nathan is explaining to Caleb that he used user data in order to make this AI, and he says specifically, quote, "It was the weird thing about striking engines. They were like striking oil in a world that hadn't invented internal combustion. They gave too much raw material. No one knew what to do with it. My competitors were fixated on sucking it up and trying to monetize via shopping and social media. They thought engines were a map of what people were thinking, but actually they were a map of how people were thinking. Impulse response, fluid, imperfect, pattern, chaotic." And this is super interesting to me because this was written in, I guess, like around 2014. And in 2019, Shoshana Zuboff would come out with The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And basically in this book, she writes about the fact that human behavior is turned into what is called prediction products, which, quote, "anticipate what you will do now, soon, and later." These prediction products are traded in a new kind of marketplace for behavioral predictions that I call behavioral future markets. Surveillance capitalists have grown immensely wealthy from these trading operations, for many companies are eager to lay bets on our future behavior. And I think that this was honestly really well discussed in Ex Machina, and I thought that it just really opened up interesting conversations about the ethics of just this like rampant technological process, as well as the ethics of AI. For example, I really like this video by Shaun that talks about Wikipedia's plot simplification of the film, and I definitely suggest checking that out next if you have some time. It's honestly really a shame that Garland wasn't able to bring any of these really interesting conversations into Civil War, because I think it would have like really modernized a very contemporary issue in a really interesting way. I know that Garland states that the whole idea about this film is it's, you know, issues are supposed to be just like repeating themselves. We're trying to fix problems of history, and this is not just an explicitly contemporary issue, but it does take place in the present, and I think that's worth discussing, especially since he sees social media as being such a plague in this political climate. So how does social media work to create these kind of like bubbles of polarization? In order to understand that, we're going to have to look to goated digital humanities scholar Wendy Chun and her concept of homophily. Now, homophily speaks to the idea of online clusters that are often algorithmically created in order to bring together communities based on shared interests and ideas. And while this seems kind of idyllic, it's way more sinister than it might seem. Firstly, like I just stated, it's really important to note that a lot of these communities are created algorithmically. Secondly, it's important to note that American social media companies are all pretty much monopolies run by the same few guys. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, you know them. I hope you don't love them, but you know them. And beyond these being networks for communication, networking, and sharing ideas, social media is first and foremost for profit. It is for profit based on ad revenue and based on the selling of user data. It's really in the best interest of these tech monopolies to utilize user data in order to steer them towards content that will put users in boxes based on interest and mutual ideas in order to better target advertising and information towards them, and then extract even more data from them. These online communities are often very insular, and that can be kind of a big problem because many times they tend to push other groups out. I don't have the exact quote, but Wendy Chun says something kind of interesting like, how do we show our love in these communities? By pushing other people away. Now, polarization in the age of social media is so rampant right now because of the way that these platforms are just based around ideas of clicks and interactions. Rage bait is a prime example of this. The Wikipedia definition of rage bait is, quote, a negative form of clickbaiting as it relies on manipulating users to respond in kind to offensive, inflammatory headlines, memes, tropes, or comments. Think about the amount of times you've just seen like the most insane rage-inducing headline on social media, how many times you've shared it with your friends out of outrage, or how many times you've seen like your mega conservative aunt or uncle just post these headlines fear-mongering. Rage bait is great for the Elons and the Zuckerbergs of the world because the more you're angry, the more you interact, the more you spend time on the app, the more ads you see, and the more money goes directly into their pockets. Now, I guess getting back to my Civil War beef, I do understand, again, where Garland is coming from here. The ideas that Garland has here aren't really my problem as much as the way that he frames them in his film through this just like contextless objectivity. Okay, so important for the context of what we're going to be talking about now. Garland self-identifies as a left-leaning moderate or a centrist. In his silly little interview with Pod Save America, he goes on this like rant about how he's just like so brave for being a moderate in a time of political polarization and how he can't be biased because he has friends who are Trump voters.
I realized I'm not left-wing, I'm centrist. That is to say, I'm left of center. And it was the word centrist and the way I felt attached to the concept of centrism and suddenly having a kind of epiphany about it in a way. I don't care about left-right when the issue is centrism versus extremism. And at that point, I'm a centrist and I have far, far more in common with someone on the center-right than I do on an extreme. I can't be prejudiced because I have right-wing friends.
He doesn't believe in the free market, but others do, and that's fine. It's not unethical to believe in the free market.
You can make an ethical judgment on the basis of whether they're racist or not. You certainly can't make an ethical judgment based on whether someone believes in the free market. I don't believe in the free market, but I don't think the argument for it is irrational or unethical. I just don't happen to agree with it.
And do I understand where he's coming from? Sure. Do I agree with what he's saying? No, not at all. In researching this video, as I said before, I spoke with my good friend Katia Loinez, and beyond our conversation about objectivity, we also spoke a bit about the importance of context.
Well, I think context is important because it just explains how the situation came to be. I feel like a lot of like corporate or establishment media can often just start off like, I don't know if we're using the October 7th example, they can just be like, oh, look, Hamas killed a bunch of Israelis, but there's no mention of the occupation and the kind of entire like human rights abuses that led to the situation. So like if we're going to report on that, we're going to explain like the occupation, the apartheid, and a lot of people, especially people who might be more center, liberal, or right wing, who could be in favor of military escalation in Gaza and in Palestine, straight up like maybe they don't know about something like this. So in explaining that like this is an apartheid, it kind of gets everyone on the same page. And I think that is important because fundamentally, I think a lot of readers have many concerns. So if we're going to something a little, I was gonna say less contentious and be like climate change, but like I guess like vaccines or like things of public health concern. I think Naomi Klein talks a lot about the doppelganger effect of like how the right can often take concerns that the left has, specifically about like health and government overreach, and can play off the same fears that a lot of progressives have. So, for example, one of our criticisms was that in the pandemic, leftists were not critical enough about the roles of pharmaceutical companies, and instead, we're obviously talking about like the importance of like collective safety, but didn't have any critique. And so you had a lot of normal people be radicalized to be pretty anti-vax because they had honestly pretty legitimate concerns about this. So I think a lot of capital L liberal media is often like shat on by right-wing conservatives because they're just like, these liberals just want you to like wear a mask and like be stupid. But it's not necessarily like pandering to them, but like it's really important to explain this context, treat your audience like they're smart. And I think this idea that there has to be a center playing to both sides is honestly patronizing. It kind of just reinforces that entire image of like liberals as being like smug and self-serving. If you like see the right as like stupider than you, because they're not. Like they're running circles around all progressives right now. They have stronger rhetoric. They are getting more politicians elected. Like they know what they're doing. And I think that a lot of discourse on centricism, especially from the left as like a way to mitigate the right, is done in like bad faith in it. Yeah.
So while I've spoken a lot about context relating to journalism and social media, let's dive now into some theory relating to some of the ideas that the film was criticized for I guess lacking context about. So I've been throwing around the terms neoliberalism and free market here and there, and I understand that these are terms that are sometimes a little bit harder to grasp or they're kind of misunderstood or misused. So what are we dealing with here? Basically, neoliberalist theory claims that, quote, a largely unregulated capitalist system or a free market economy not only embodies the ideal of free individual choice, but also achieves optimum economic performance with respect to efficiency, economic growth, technological process, and distributional justice, unquote. Essentially, neoliberalism kind of promotes the idea that if businesses and public services are able to kind of operate freely and without government intervention, this will lead to more economic freedom and fairness. Now, neoliberalism really came into the public eye in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan as the President of the United States and Margaret Thatcher as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. During this time, Reagan and Thatcher were able to implement deregulation measures and tax cuts, while Thatcher's administration saw the privatization of many government-regulated industries like communications and transportation. Free market ideology actually goes a lot deeper than just Reagan and Thatcher. I don't have time to completely dive into it, but for this portion, I'm going to be leaning heavily on Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, which I really suggest you check out. If you don't feel like reading a whole book, there's also a shorter documentary which kind of dives into some of the themes. So if that's something that interests you, I'd heavily suggest checking that out. Basically, the shock doctrine maps out the history of disaster capitalism, a term which essentially speaks to the use of disaster and man-made conflicts used in order to justify and incorporate neoliberal free market ideologies into the mainstream. Klein links the testing of shock therapy conducted by the CIA in the 50s and 60s to the creation and implementation of free market ideologies by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. Now, through a series of what Klein would refer to, I guess, as tests, these measures were implemented in the 1970s in South America, most notably in Chile, where they were currently facing a military coup. The effect of free market economics here was just devastating. It didn't work. And at the time, neoliberalism and free market ideologies were not very popular, to say the least. And while these weren't popular, Milton Friedman was coming in with a tactic. Quote, waiting for major crises, then selling off pieces of the state to private players while citizens were still reeling in from the shock, then quickly making the reforms permanent. This tactic has proved to be extremely effective, seeing that a large portion of the world is currently undergoing the effects of free market capitalism, whether it be through the privatization of state-sanctioned services and institutions or through shady IMF policies. And if you're interested in that, you should watch my video. Much like our discussion of false agency in the online age, there's a false sense of choice within our acceptance of systems like free market. Although empires are very effective in weaving together narratives that kind of create this illusion of choice. As a more contemporary example, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Friedman saw this as a great opportunity to make some changes to the New Orleans school systems, which before Hurricane Katrina were primarily publicly run. Within 19 months of the hurricane, with a large portion of New Orleans' poor population still in crisis, the public school system was essentially eradicated, being replaced instead by a bunch of privately run charter schools. Klein writes that, quote, New Orleans teachers used to be represented by a strong union. Now the union's contracts had been shredded and its 4,700 members had all been fired. Some younger teachers were rehired by the charters at reduced salaries, most were not, unquote. And you know what? It's funny. I don't agree with this, but I have friends who believe in free market ideology, and I don't want a civil war, so I accept this. I'm kidding. That was my really fantastic Alex Garland impression. Please don't use that out of context. I think that free market ideology is disgusting. It takes advantage of the most marginalized communities and really only seeks to benefit those on top. I guess when you think of neoliberalism as a right-wing ideology and then you kind of have like both sides kind of going at it, that's one thing. But when we look at the greater context and history of neoliberalism, we can really see that free market ideology kind of harms both sides equally, especially in people in lower socioeconomic situations. And without that context, we wouldn't really come to this point. And this conclusion that we just came to is not the product of having like a moderate left-right debate. This is an unabashedly leftist take. When I say that free market capitalism hurts both sides, I am not calling the right stupid or misinformed. I'm saying that this system hurts both sides equally, and there are solutions that could help both of them. Garland writes that aside from being a film about journalism, Civil War is, quote, also about fascism, and it's about if you erode a system of checks and balances, which includes the fourth estate, journalism, it puts you on the road to fascism. I think for me, fascism is not a distant prospect. It's something that people can drift towards. It's not distant. Those men are real people that came out of different sorts of contexts. You could add a whole bunch of people to that list, and you can see these people emerge from communism, from democracy, from theocracies, all sorts of different spaces. So for that reason, the threat they pose is shared. And yes, I agree with Garland that fascism does pose a threat onto everyone equally, the right and left, regardless. But I can promise you that by the very definition of fascism, this will not be coming from a left-wing group, which is largely tied to Antifa, a very loosely linked network whose ultimate goal is to fight against fascism. By definition, this whole capitalist shit show, these implementations of really harmful and controversial measures, it's not fascism. But how is this not a cause worth being very passionate about? If a citizen's voice is their vote, then what happens in situations like this? These sneaky attacks against democracy, which just then become publicly accepted. And then you have people like Garland being like, free market ideology isn't unethical. It's unethical for me to call it bad. So, I don't know. To be complacent in this matter is to be complacent in very real issues of violence against marginalized communities who are taken advantage of in states of shock. Violence really goes beyond war, and violence that is state-sanctioned does not make this violence any less real. The free market is not good, and I feel like if Garland had any of these contexts or really understand its history, he wouldn't be so apathetic about the subject. Not supporting ideas, but then also just accepting them really just makes you look like a pawn of the state, which is just objectively not a cute look. So what exactly is fascism? This is a really loaded question. I really don't have time to make a whole video essay on fascism right now. I'll give you just a brief rundown, but there are some really fantastic video essays on YouTube on the topic. Check those out. But essentially, Robert Paxton defines fascism as, quote, a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaborations with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion, unquote. And in order to kind of break down this kind of dense definition, we can quickly take a look at some of the hallmark traits of fascism. The first would be extreme nationalism. The most famous example would undoubtedly be the ethnocentric nationalism found in Nazi Germany, violently perpetuating the superiority of the Aryan race. The second would be an emphasis on traditionalism and rejection of modernity. Third, cult of personality. Fascist regimes are headed by leaders who become the charismatic poster child for the far-right movements. 4, appealing to social frustrations and economic and political crises. 5, a disregard for human rights and views that oppose those of the fascist regime. 6, an emphasis on popular mobilization as opposed to authoritarianism, which seeks to pacify citizens. 7, military supremacy. And 8, the controlling of mass media. In preparing for the filming of Civil War, Garland had his entire cast watch the 1985 Soviet Belarusian film Come and See, which Garland states exists as the only true anti-war film, as other anti-war films like Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now may inadvertently kind of glorify certain aspects of war by portraying a hero's journey, or by portraying that by having certain skill sets and a certain mindset, you can survive the war. For those of you who haven't seen Come and See, it's a genuinely horrific, disturbing, but very impactful film about the massacre of Soviet Belarusians by the Nazis in World War II. Beyond its really graphic and upsetting portrayals of violence, the film is grounded in political context, the invasion of Nazi Germany and Soviet Belarus. This film is powerful in its anti-fascist sentiments and effectively portrays the horrors of fascism through its strength of clarity in its ideas and its context. The film is unabashedly anti-fascist and pro-Belarusian partisan resistance from beginning to end. And while Come and See is very grounded in real events, other films have succeeded in portraying fictionalized what-if scenarios of American fascism, most notably Peter Watkins' Punishment Park, which posits an alternate reality in which the Nixon administration captures, tortures, and imprisons potential threats to the state, many of which are just young, peaceful, left-wing people. Now, the thing about Come and See and Punishment Park is the fact that they don't really try to punish their audiences who, for the most part, are just kind of citizens of the state. While Civil War clearly takes an anti-fascist stance, this idea leans heavily on the idea that if US citizens don't get their shit together and pacify themselves, there's gonna be a war, and what can they say? They made this happen. Civil War, Garland critiques an inherently cinematic view of what fascism looks like without giving much information. The president is very much a movie fascist in the way that we can view a character like Red Skull. What does it mean to be a fascist in America? The film isn't really that interested in showing this beyond the idea that he is a 3-term president. He is suppressing people who are trying to have this uprising. We don't really get more context from that, which is really frustrating because, again, this is why films like Come and See and Punishment Park work. I really do not think that Garland is trying to be malicious. I just really think that he just like doesn't understand what he's talking about for the most part, which is unfortunately kind of evident in some of his interviews where he's just kind of like, I don't know, talking out of his ass. But it's a shame because there are some really interesting ideas in here which could have been made really interesting had he just done a bit more research, if he had just talked more based on actual, I don't know, like facts, definitions, history, as opposed to, I guess, just his own interpretations of what's going on right now. Like I've said a couple times, I think, in this video, it's very true that opposing members of political parties are oftentimes way more on the same page than they might think. In my conversation with Katia Loinez, she mentions the Canadian Freedom Convoy as an example of this. In the Breaches article, What the Left Can Learn from the Freedom Convoy, Emma Jackson breaks down the ways in which this pivotal right-wing moment in contemporary politics sheds light on the ways that the right wing has been an effective movement and the ways in which the right and left may be more on the same page than we might think. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Canadian Freedom Convoy, in early 2022, flocks of right-wingers came to Ottawa to protest national COVID-19 vaccine and mask mandates. At the same time, the United We Roll Yellow Vest convoy is taking place, a movement that is pro-pipeline and anti-immigration. In this article, Jackson articulates a situation which took place at this protest, writing, "After being shoved by a white man in his 50s into the grill guard of a semi-trailer, I ended up on one side of a police barricade, face to face with another man from Red Deer who was wearing a Make Canada Great Again hat. Trudeau shouldn't be letting in immigrants while I struggle to pay my bills," he screamed at me. I yelled back, "I came here from Alberta and I hate Trudeau too." He froze, staring at me incredulously. Standing across from him, it was clear. We both understood the system was rigged against us, but we had been organized into radically different understandings of how it was rigged, and more importantly, what was to be done about it. She goes on to explain that instead, we have to learn what the right is doing successfully. We have to listen to their stories about power and control and counter it with a more compelling story of our own. People have every reason to be angry. They know the system is rigged against them. It's up to us to tell a new story of how it's rigged, one that doesn't scapegoat Jews, immigrants, Indigenous people, and racialized folks, but instead unites across our divisions and turns us collectively against those at the very top who are raking in billions off our backs. So yes, sorry to tell you, California and Texas can be on the same side. We'll let Garland have that one. Everyone is angry, or everyone has the capacity to be angry. And anger is so misunderstood as a concept and as an emotion. Anger can be understood through various tropes, like the angry Black or Indigenous woman, the angry queer, the angry feminist, as examples. It can also be used to describe hate groups, such as white supremacists. And I think it would be very unfair to kind of equate these two groups, because anger stemming from marginalized communities really comes from a place of being oppressed and being angry with this oppression, while the anger from far-right groups really stems from a frustration with being unable to properly oppress these groups. So before we get into the ways that anger can be useful, let's first talk about the ways in which it's not. We'll go back to my favorite interview, the Alex Garland Pod Save America one, where basically he just goes on this whole rant about how Trump isn't actually a Republican, which I don't think is like the issue here. I think the issue is more that he just like openly supports white supremacists. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. In the Antifa manual, Mark Bray explains that Trump and the alt-right didn't create each other, but quote, both Trump and the alt-right have managed to tap into a widespread white conservative anxiety about the rapid demise of traditional white America, an anxiety about the fact that they're losing the demographic battle and will no longer constitute a majority of the population in a generation, that they're losing the cultural war as gay marriage has become legal, that the notion of white privilege is gaining currency, that the Black struggle is ascendant, that rape culture is being targeted, the transgender identity and rights are increasingly legitimated. Moreover, liberal elitism and neoliberalism have hardened reactionary sentiments among many working class whites, unquote. Further, Wendy Chun kind of explains the idea that these far-right groups have really co-opted the idea of the chosen family, which has historically been used by queer communities who have been shunned by their own biological families, and then create communities out of people who accept them. They're really just trying to kind of like latch on to this idea that they're also oppressed. This kind of anger, this need to push away this hatred, is something that Garland definitely understands as being bad, which is really evident in the What Kind of American Are You scene, in which Jesse Plemons really just grills the group of journalists, asking them,
"What kind of American are you?"
Which is a loaded question about race and nationality, and it's pretty messed up. Now, this is the kind of violence that Garland understands as being extreme, and we can understand this as being far-right ideology. So now let's go over and take a look at the far left. We can start off strong by saying that Alex Garland doesn't know what Antifa is.
Antifa? Well, guess what? America showed up!
We briefly touched on the Antifa massacres before. He really popped the fuck off with that one. Antifa is not just like a solid movement. It's really more of an ideology, or at the most just like a loose network of people who seek to fight fascist ideologies. And a lot of the violence stemming from this is based on ideas of stopping this hate or self-defense. But circling back to the Breaches piece about the convoys, there's something so poignant here about the idea of anger. These two opposing groups, the right and left, battling a system that seeks to oppress them, although they have wildly different ideas as to what the actual problem is and what solutions would be effective. Garland really thought he did something with this idea in the Christmas shootout scene. Basically, there's these two guys in the trenches. They're in a shootout with these people in a house, and then the journalists are like, "Who are you shooting at?" And they're like, "We don't know."
I do not want to be prejudiced. I can't be prejudiced because I have right-wing friends.
So I guess you can say that's like a really diluted version of what Emma Jackson is talking about in the Convoy article. I wonder what could have made that a little more clear, have the idea come through a bit. Let me think. Context. Civil War is not Garland's first rodeo when it comes to talking about anger and violence. We see it in pretty much all his films. The anger of men in Men, violence and climate change and annihilation, the bitter anger of Gen X white men in his first novel, The Beach. But in relation to our conversation about Civil War, I want to focus on one work in particular right now. Garland's foray into the world of filmmaking, 28 Days Later, a film that is inherently about rage and violence. Like I stated a million years ago in this video, the zombie virus is caused by an outbreak in a lab in which a study on rage is being conducted. The zombies are therefore motivated by rage. Let's quickly take a look at the third act of the film, where Jim and his new family make it to the army base, which has promised salvation. They find here that the answer to salvation is women, and more specifically in the sexual slavery of women in order to reproduce and create a new society. 28 Days Later, aside from being like a pretty openly scathing critique of the military, is politically quite open-ended. Honestly, I think you could even argue that it could be read as an apolitical film, but like I've spoken about in some of my other videos, I don't think that apolitical horror exists. In fact, in Great Horror, the filmmaker allows viewers to work through a number of different difficult ideas through the structure and plot of the film. In Great Horror, people are able to use narrative structures to work through a number of different political ideas. 28 Days Later has been read through issues of xenophobia, fear of underdeveloped countries, among other things. Therefore, it wasn't a huge stretch to me to read this film through the bigger ideas seen in Civil War. Zombies themselves are historically linked to Black slavery. Within Haitian zombie folklore, zombies bring about the fear of the return of the repressed, a common term used in horror films used to describe the fear of the uprising of oppressed groups. 28 Days Later was released in 2002 following 9/11, which with it came an influx of xenophobia, primarily directed at Arab people, but also to other marginalized groups. The film's military compound has been read by some as a failure of patriarchal apocalypse fantasies, which seek to oppress outsiders in the name of national security. To have a black man turn zombie chained up in a pretty uniformly white compound is very telling of this. When reading the film in this light, the rage virus makes sense. A mass rising of anger from a place of oppression, one which may not be properly targeted, but is nevertheless valid. The violence of the film straddles many lines: the untargeted, the targeted, the hateful, and the self-defensive. At the end of the film, Jim's rage-fueled massacre of the army shows a side of him that is animalistic, and may even seem inhumane. In Introduction to Civil War, Tikkun notes that the state seeks to pacify the individual, elaborating that, quote, "In order to become a political subject in the modern state, each body must submit to the machinery that will make it such. It must begin by casting aside its passions, which are now inappropriate, its tastes now laughable, its pensions now contingent, endowing itself instead with interests, which are much more representable, and even better, representable. In this way, in order to become a political subject, each body must first carry out its own auto-castration as an economic subject. Ideally, the political subject will thus be reduced to nothing more than a pure vote, a pure voice," unquote. Essentially, through pacification and just pure trust in the state, the individual is really just at the will of empire. Through freeing oneself from their given space within the society created by empire, one gains the freedom to think of themselves and the idea of community beyond these grips. This idea can be really easily linked to ideas we're talking about in regards to algorithmically created communities. The internet is a system created by tech giants made to put the individual into pre-made boxes, giving them a false sense of agency. Much like Jim, Selena, and Hannah's trust in the army compound, this sense of safety is really false, but it's seductive. It promises solutions and community to those in need. So, as a little thought experiment, why don't we just take the narrative structure of this film and kind of like infuse it with some of the ideas of Civil War? Let's say that the zombies are the more moderate right and left. They're very angry, but they're not completely sure at what. They're like the shooters in Civil War, not completely sure what they're shooting at, but shooting nevertheless. Let's say that the army is Nick Offerman's fascist government, which has risen in the wake of crisis. Then we can ask, who exactly are Jim, Selena, and Hannah in this context? Which Civil War characters do they kind of take on? Throughout the film, they seek safety from the virus before realizing that the group of men who promised them protection were really there to harm them, and they simply exist as a means to an end. At the end of the film, Jim fights back, release the chained zombie, and the two of them overpower the entire army. Jim frees his new family, and the group escapes, creating their own haven. This is a group of people who have functionally understood the violence of a new empire, overpowered and reinterpreted the meaning of community. They, in this instance, are nothing less than anti-fascists. I personally think that this interpretation of 28 Days Later is more clear and frankly better than the general premise of Civil War, because Garland isn't just so hell-bent on being like, actually guys, the state might actually have our best interest in mind, so maybe we should just like chill. Like, that doesn't really make sense to me, especially in a story that leans so heavily on concepts of fascism. In Intro to Civil War, Tikkun writes that, quote, "It's no use distinguishing between cops and citizens. Under empire, the difference between the police and the population is abolished. Under empire, we monitor our own behavior and the behavior of others based on the laws kind of put in place by the state." Civil War is so just like muddied by its own sense of self-importance and its state bootlicking that it really honestly almost comes off like a piece of like state propaganda if you really think about it. The state seeks to kind of just maintain control and keep the status quo, and by God, Garland is kind of doing the same thing here. Garland is correct in suggesting that in their most moderate nature, the left and right seek to create a sense of political passivity to counter political unrest, while the more radical left and right seek to create actual reforms in the ways in which societies are structured and run. While far-right groups seek to, in a sense, strengthen these ideas, many far-right groups are run with the idea of social justice in mind, beyond the idea of pacifying violence in a society that has failed them. In the context of American empire, violence is justified by the state and only the state. This violence is put in place with the objective of keeping the peace, which is oftentimes a nice way of saying oppressing those who oppose the rules of the state. Aside from fringe, far-right hate groups and oppressive right-wing politics, the anger that arises from feeling small, from feeling like there's no opportunities for you, for feeling unseen, this anger should be focused on systems that seek to oppress. Social media and journalist empires, the states that unfairly use crisis as a means to implement very harmful social and economic measures. When we talk about trust in journalism, we really have to look at these monopolies. Political polarization is rampant amongst the general population, yes, but it is by no small means created by these monopolies at the end of the day. In order to make these changes, I don't see how pacifying ourselves is the solution here. Rather, I think that there needs to be more passion. People need to be more outspoken about issues that are really harming them and harming the population at large. The point is not to pacify, it's about trying to be passionate about finding actual solutions, ones which frankly can't really come out of this current system. And if there were to be a civil war, the idea of people rising up against tech industries and these capitalist monopolies would make sense. This is something that Garland is actually trying to say through this film, through this need to band together to defend democracy, but he kind of fails to realize that through grounding this idea in like actual context, this would make sense. It's more than just like a science fiction-ass fascist villain. There are big villains right now, and he's very aware of it. He talks about it. He talks about tech monopolies being bad. I just don't understand why he couldn't just infuse some of that context. It's really, really frustrating. Furthermore, the film kind of does a weak job of kind of explaining what journalism could be, because it really just exists in this really pre-existing structure, this need to be objective, this kind of glorification of old school journalism, which is clearly failing both the journalists and the people consuming the news. In my conversation with Katya, she spoke to me about the transformative potentials of journalism, the ways in which harnessing this anger through the proper context, through providing solutions that seek to aid those affected by them, can lead to actual change. If Ex Machina is a parable about the power of tech moguls, then Garland should understand the importance of context in talking about this power within political polarization. It makes no sense to just tell people to simply write off social media, because it's become such an integral part of our lives, part of work, part of being social, part of so many things. If Garland's main goal with this film was to spark conversation about current American political systems, I guess he succeeded. I made this video. This film sparked so much controversy. So many people were talking about it. However, a lot of the conversations that came out of this film proved that the film was kind of just unsuccessful, because a lot of what I was seeing was just like a lot of like moderate left and right people either being like, yeah, we should chill, or people being just getting mad that he's not taking a side. So I really just don't think his idea came through, because I think at the end of the day, he has an idea that makes sense. Just the way he's saying it, it doesn't at all. And this could have been so easily avoided. My favorite criticism of this film comes from Omar Al-Akkad in a CBC interview in which he states, quote, "I think it's a political movie by virtue of its negative space, where you have this film that is desperately wanting for the moral righteousness of resistance, but also the comfort and stability of an empire. And those are two fundamentally opposing things. And what you end up with is a kind of mush," unquote. This is so wonderfully put, and honestly just encompasses a lot of the ideas that I wanted to discuss in this very, very long video. Having a strong opinion and being loud about it is not cowardly or wrong at all. This is literally like a tactic of the empire that they want to use to pacify you, to make you think that this isn't civil, this isn't right. But if you are very passionate about an issue, you should be loud about it. You should be critical of the state. You should be critical of big tech. Don't buy into the myth of objective journalism. It is honestly just really beautiful to care. And to finish off this video, I just have a little message for my Canadian viewers. If you didn't know, I am Canadian, and yes, Canadians care more about American politics than Canadian politics. But I'm sure a lot of you are aware, in Canada at least, of Bill C-18. Essentially, Bill C-18, or the Online News Act, according to the BBC, quote, was introduced by Canada as a way to enhance fairness for news publishers by carving out ways for them to be compensated by tech giants. It applies to companies that operate social media platforms or search engine websites in Canada, where news is often shared and disseminated, and that have a total global revenue of more than $1 billion in a calendar year. Now, Meta has basically now just been blocking links to Canadian news articles because it doesn't want to compensate these organizations, which is just so shitty, and I think it's just really telling. It just really fits into a lot of concepts that we've been talking about social media, moguls, and news. But anyways, this is all to say that this is really harmful, and that you should go right now and look into some of your local independent journalist outlets, give them a follow, give The Breach a follow. Yeah, stay informed. And if you haven't seen Civil War yet, I mean, good luck. It's really bad. And that's all I have to say for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I love you.